One thing I've mentioned from time to time over the last few years is this idea of an exposure diamond, not a triangle. Everyone, when they talk about exposure, even to this day, talks about the exposure triangle being your aperture, ISO, and shutter. And that is true. It's a good baseline to start with, but it's a little misleading, especially when it comes to video, as well as photography, which you can see here. There's other people talking about the exposure diamond in terms of flash power. So if you're doing photography and you want to use a flash, you factor that flash power in, and that's how you can kind of calculate your exposure using this diamond analogy. Aperture, shutter, ISO, and flash. But for video, when you're not using flash, there still is an exposure diamond, and it's your ND filter. So your neutral density. The simplest way I can describe ND is just sunglasses for your camera. And so when you factor that into your exposure, you really do have a diamond or a square, but I think diamond sounds a little bit better than square. And that exposure diamond is your aperture, ISO, shutter, speed, or angle. I prefer shutter angle. That's a whole nother topic that we can get to in another video. And your fourth corner there is your ND. And I think this is pretty common now that a lot of people understand for video, you need some kind of neutral density in front of your lens to filter out in huge amounts of light, especially the sun being probably the most common. Sunlight is incredibly bright. It's very powerful. So you need to use ND filters to drop that exposure so your aperture, your ISO, and your shutter can be what you want them to be. Now, what's kind of confusing, I think, at first for people when they're getting into this concept of how do I expose my image properly, what ends up kind of being the easiest shortcut that I found is if you're shooting video, let's just talk about that because we can talk about photography another time, but let's just focus on video. Your shutter speed is based on your frame rate. And this is the shutter angle, 1 over 180 degree shutter angle rule. Shutter angle, if you set it to 180 degrees, that's going to give you proper motion blur for most situations based on your frame rate. That's why a lot of people will do 1 over 2 times their frame rate. So like 1/48th, 1 over 120 if you're shooting 60 frames a second. There's a lot of math involved, but in general, just understand for video that most of the time your shutter speed or your shutter angle are going to be fixed. It's not a variable that you can control or change for your exposure. So on that exposure diamond for video, shutter speed is kind of locked based on your frame rate. We can get into the weeds another time on that, but hopefully you just understand that concept that your shutter speed is fixed. You're not changing it to adjust your exposure. At least you shouldn't be, unless you want to start affecting your motion blur. The other thing that's usually fixed that you're not changing all that often is your aperture. So when you're shooting video, usually you'll want a certain depth of field for the shot. If you're doing a close-up, maybe you want a deeper depth of field to show more detail. If you're doing a wider shot, maybe you want a shallower depth of field. But either way, for the shot, for the clip, whatever you're recording, that aperture isn't as much about exposure as it is for depth of field, usually when you actually start understanding how these things work. And so you end up with an aperture that for the most part you kind of want fixed. Maybe it's f2, maybe it's 2.8, maybe it's f4, maybe it's f1.4. It doesn't really matter what it is, what that number is. It's the idea that you're controlling your depth of field, and so that number is relatively fixed. On something like full frame, maybe you want that super shallow depth of field. So you're going to shoot it like a f2, and you want that depth of field, so you don't want to change it. You don't want to shoot an f8, you don't want to shoot it at f11 or an f16 because that's too much depth of field for whatever you're filming. So your aperture is also fixed. Now, in this scenario where your shutter speed is fixed, your aperture is fixed, that's going to require you to use ND filters to some extent, almost guaranteed, especially with today's cameras and just how fast they are in terms of seeing light, the sensitivity to the light. Even a normal room, like this room, this light is set at like a 2% just because the cameras nowadays are so sensitive. They can see almost in the dark. So the moment you start introducing light, they're good. Their exposure's fine. So you're going to need some kind of ND filter almost always, unless you have control over the lighting, which I guess would be like the 5th quadrant. So maybe it's an exposure pentagon. We're not there yet. Let's stick with the diamond. So you're going to use an ND filter, which is also fixed because most ND systems are not variable. There are a few that are, but most of you out there are going to be shooting with fixed NDs. So you're also not using those to control your exposure. You're going to put an ND8 and ND64. Let's use a real example. So shooting outside, the sun is very bright. So I'm going to shoot with an ND64 often. My aperture, maybe I want at like an f2.8 to control the depth of field. And I know I'm using the 180 degree shutter angle rule. The only thing left to actually control the exposure is your ISO. And that is an electronic amplification of the signal, which in a lot of ways is the best way to control exposure because the only variable there is noise. And most of these cameras are clean enough nowadays. Most software can run some kind of noise reduction. And in general, the moment you export the video and it goes through compression, a lot of that noise gets stripped away anyway. You can see lots of people trying to add film grain to their videos to make them look more cinematic and struggling with compression just because the compression takes away all that fine texture. It removes all the detail. And then you factor in the fact that most people are watching on their cell phone, their smartphone, a small little tablet screen, or maybe it's on a TV across the room, then it's just on in the background. Most people aren't obsessed with, the noise of an image because it just gets filtered out. And by the time they're actually watching it, they're not even seeing it. So if you're shooting with a clean enough camera, like a full frame camera in this situation, the only thing you have to worry about in terms of exposure is your ISO. And this is great because it's one variable. Instead of an exposure diamond or a triangle or a pentagon, you just have exposure, which is your ISO, your amplification of the light. And it seems really complicated to get to that point, but what it ends up doing is it makes shooting way, way easier. Because if your aperture is fixed to control the depth of field, if your shutter speed is fixed to control the motion blur, if your ND filter is fixed because it literally is just a fixed filter that you put in front of the lens, the only thing left to mess with is ISO. And that makes it really, really easy to shoot whatever you need, because instead of controlling 4 different variables, which you could go down that rabbit hole, and you certainly could for every shot, change each of these settings. Oh, I want more motion blur or less motion blur, so I'm gonna adjust my shutter. I want more depth of field, less depth of field. I'm gonna control my aperture. I'm gonna keep switching my ND filters out depending on the shot. You can go to all those lengths and means, and you can do that. Maybe a little bit easier if you're on a film set working with a crew and you can take your time and you're doing one shot at a time. But if you're run and gun, and you're just trying to capture whatever's happening in the moment, maybe it's documentary, reality, a wedding, I don't know, whatever you're filming, it doesn't really matter. If you simplify your exposure to just ISO, and you think about that diamond, but you simplify to just ISO, you all automatically just kind of unlock this ability to shoot simple, quick, efficiently, because all you're changing is your ISO. And again, if you're shooting with a camera that's clean enough, that noise isn't necessarily a problem. Something like the S5 Mark II that I've been shooting with recently, the ISO is perfectly acceptable and clean up to 6400, but also down to 640. So that's my range. That's my window of ISO, 640 to 6400, if you want to phrase it a different way. I have that whole room to play with my exposure, up, down, not sideways, but up, down, and sideways, if you want to think of it that way, just sliding my ISO. And what's even easier, even easier, as nowadays the auto features on most of these cameras are good enough. I wouldn't recommend auto white balance. That's still kind of a whole can of worms and kind of annoying unless you're actively locking it when you're shooting, which is a good way to use auto white balance. But still, for color, I think it's far too important. You got to get that right in camera and then just only small tweaks in post-production. But auto ISO, it's kind of a lazy shortcut. It's kind of an easy solution, but that can take away a lot of the difficulty of exposing anyway, especially if you're filming with something that has like a little bit more leeway anyway. So maybe something like a vlog, a YouTube video, something that is like, it doesn't need to be picture perfect. That auto ISO works generally pretty well on the Lumix cameras anyway. I'd say the newer Lumix cameras all have great auto ISO that does change if the light is changing, but that's kind of what you want it to do anyway, to try and get an even exposure. The only time it's really truly a problem is if there's something overwhelming in the frame, like something really bright or something really dark, like a black, outfit, which I guess I'm wearing right now, so it maybe would be a problem. But in general, I think the auto ISO works well enough for maybe like 80% of scenarios. So now you're down to like exposing for nothing, meaning like you don't have to worry about it. If you're using autofocus and phase detect, face tracking, that kind of stuff, now you're not even worried about focus. So all you have to worry about is framing, composition, holding the camera stable, some of like the basic camera operator 101 type stuff. And if you know all the information and how it works in the back of your head, you can react quickly to any problems that may arise from shooting this way. And so that's a long way to say, for video, it is an exposure diamond. You need to factor all 4 of those things in when you're exposing your frame. But honestly, for video, it ends up getting way easier once you understand how they all work and you just set your settings the way you want them and you just think about your ISO. And yeah, you can dial that in intentionally using manual ISO, or you can use auto ISO if you're in a scenario where it's a little bit more unpredictable. Wouldn't trust it entirely 100%. It still has, some problems here and there. But if you understand how it's working, you can use it when it's appropriate and not use it when you need more manual control. And that's the way I've been approaching exposure lately. I think it's really nice just to simplify by expanding. Everyone wants to simplify to the exposure triangle. It's really the diamond, maybe even the pentagon, as we talked about with controlling your lights. And if you have multiple lights, maybe you factor even those in as well. But I guess that's a tease for another video, that ultimately the best way to get your exposure is to set all your settings in camera, have them all locked. So you know your ND, you know your aperture, you know your shutter, and you know you want your ISO low because that's going to be less noise. So if that's all fixed, you're really controlling exposure outside the camera with the lighting setup that you're using. Now that's in a scenario with 100% controlled light. Most people probably aren't shooting that way all the time unless they're in a studio, in which case then great. Get your camera settings, have those locked, and then control your exposure with the lights. But for most of us, if you're out and about in the real world, you're going to have practical lights, or you're going to have the sun changing outside or coming through a window that you're going to have to adjust to. So I'll wrap it up there and say, think of the exposure diamond. Let's talk about the exposure diamond. I don't want to really talk about the exposure triangle anymore. I think it's far too simplistic and a limitation and a little misleading to new beginners as they're trying to figure this stuff out. If they're trying to understand aperture and ISO and shutter and how these all work, and then you throw them a curveball like ND filters and they don't know how to process it. Let's start with what's true, especially for video and for photography for that matter. ND filters are equally applicable in photography, even though they get less attention sometimes. It's the exposure diamond. Let's talk about the exposure diamond and let's go from there.